Hey Alex, I was thinking about today's episode, and I realized something interesting. We're surrounded by emotions every day, but we almost never talk about the work behind them.
That's true. We talk about being tired, stressed, overwhelmed, but we don't always talk about why it feels so heavy.
Exactly. So today the word we're exploring is emotional labor.
And this is one of those words that people experience constantly but don't always recognize or name.
At its core, emotional labor refers to the effort involved in managing emotions your own and sometimes other people's, in order to meet expectations. These expectations can come from work, family, relationships, or society in general. It's not just about feeling emotions. It's about regulating, controlling, and performing emotions in ways that are considered acceptable or useful to others.
At its core, emotional labor refers to the effort involved in managing emotions your own and sometimes other people's, in order to meet expectations. These expectations can come from work, family, relationships, or society in general. It's not just about feeling emotions. It's about regulating, controlling, and performing emotions in ways that are considered acceptable or useful to others.
And unlike physical labor, emotional labor doesn't end when the day ends. It often follows people home. You carry it in your thoughts, in your tone of voice, in the way you respond to messages, and in how you constantly adjust yourself to avoid tension, disappointment, or conflict.
That's why many people feel drained without being able to explain why. They haven't lifted anything heavy, they haven't worked extra hours, but they've spent the entire day monitoring emotions, theirs and others, and that takes real energy.
One reason emotional labor is so hard to notice is because it's often normalized. From a young age, many people, especially women, are taught to be considerate, understanding, patient, and emotionally available. Over time, this becomes automatic. You don't think, I am doing emotional labor right now. You think, this is just who I am.
And when something is framed as personality instead of effort, it stops being acknowledged. If you're naturally caring, then no one thinks to ask whether you're tired. If you're good at handling people, then no one notices the emotional cost of always being the calm one, the listener, the mediator.
Exactly. Emotional labor hides behind words like kind, easygoing, supportive, and strong. These are positive words, but they can mask the fact that someone is constantly managing emotional situations for the benefit of others.
Emotionally, it often feels like pressure without release. You may feel responsible for other people's moods. If someone is uncomfortable, you feel the urge to fix it. If someone is upset, you feel guilty even when it's not your fault.
And over time, this creates emotional fatigue. Not dramatic exhaustion, just a quiet, constant tiredness. You might feel less patient, less present, or disconnected from your own needs because so much attention has gone toward managing everyone else's emotional state.
That's an important point. Emotional labor often involves ignoring your own feelings in order to prioritize others. You learn to delay your emotions, suppress them, or explain them away. And eventually, you may lose touch with what you actually feel or need.
That's an important point. Emotional labor often involves ignoring your own feelings in order to prioritize others. You learn to delay your emotions, suppress them, or explain them away. And eventually, you may lose touch with what you actually feel or need.
One of the most common places where emotional labor appears is the workplace, especially in jobs that involve people rather than objects or systems. Customer service, education, healthcare, hospitality, administration, and management all require a high level of emotional regulation. In these roles, employees are expected not only to perform tasks, but to perform emotions. They must remain calm under pressure, friendly when exhausted, polite when disrespected, and understanding even when the situation is unfair. This expectation is rarely written in job descriptions, but it is clearly enforced through workplace culture.
Another issue is that emotional labor is unevenly distributed. Certain people are expected to do more of it than others. Women, junior employees, migrants, and people from marginalized backgrounds are often expected to be more accommodating, more patient, and more emotionally flexible. They are subtly taught that maintaining harmony is part of their responsibility, even when the conflict was not created by them. This is why emotional labor is closely connected to power dynamics, not just personality.
And this doesn't stop at paid work. Emotional labor extends into everyday life friendships, family roles, and social interactions. Think about who remembers birthdays, who notices changes in mood, who checks in first after an argument, who manages family tensions, or who keeps conversations polite even when they are uncomfortable. These tasks may look small, but together they form a constant emotional workload that often goes unrecognized.
When emotional labor is constant and unacknowledged, it often leads to burnout. Not the dramatic kind that comes from overworking physically, but a quieter burnout that shows up as emotional numbness, irritability, or loss of motivation. People may start feeling detached, resentful, or unusually tired, even when their external responsibilities haven't increased. This happens because emotional energy, like physical energy, is limited.
What's difficult is that people experiencing this kind of burnout often blame themselves. They think they are weak, ungrateful, or incapable of handling normal life. But the problem is not a lack of strength, it's a lack of recognition and balance. Emotional labor, when it is constant and one-sided, drains a person's emotional reserves. Without rest, support, or acknowledgement, even the most resilient individuals will feel overwhelmed.
This is why naming emotional labor matters. Once you have language for it, you can begin to understand your exhaustion more clearly. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What emotional work am I doing, and for whom?" Language gives structure to experience. Without words, emotions remain confusing and internalized.
From a language perspective, emotional labor is deeply connected to how we communicate in English. Politeness strategies, indirect language, tone adjustment, and emotional cushioning are all forms of emotional labor. Phrases like, "I don't want to be a problem," "It's okay, don't worry," or "I understand," are often used to manage emotional situations rather than express true feelings.
For English learners, this is especially important. Many learners focus on grammar and vocabulary, but emotional meaning often lies beneath the words. Understanding emotional labor helps learners recognize why certain phrases are used, when silence carries meaning, and why emotional politeness sometimes hides discomfort. This awareness improves not only language accuracy, but emotional intelligence in communication.
Emotional labor becomes even more complex when it enters personal relationships because, unlike work, there are no formal roles, contracts, or limits. In friendships, families, and romantic relationships, emotional labor often hides behind love, loyalty, or responsibility. People tell themselves that caring deeply means absorbing emotional weight without complaint. Over time, this belief can quietly turn relationships into emotionally unequal spaces, where one person consistently manages feelings while the other benefits from that effort without fully realizing it.
Emotional labor becomes even more complex when it enters personal relationships, because unlike work, there are no formal roles, contracts, or limits. In friendships, families, and romantic relationships, emotional labor often hides behind love, loyalty, or responsibility. People tell themselves that caring deeply means absorbing emotional weight without complaint. Over time, this belief can quietly turn relationships into emotionally unequal spaces, where one person consistently manages feelings while the other benefits from that effort without fully realizing it.
What's especially painful is that emotional labor in relationships is rarely discussed openly. The person doing the emotional work often feels guilty for even noticing the imbalance. They worry that asking for support might seem selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful. As a result, they suppress their needs and continue providing emotional care, believing that this is what love requires. Over time, this leads to emotional loneliness, the feeling of being deeply involved in others' lives while feeling unseen in your own.
Gender plays a significant role here. In many cultures, women are socialized from a young age to be emotionally aware, accommodating, and nurturing. They learn to anticipate needs, soften conflict, and maintain emotional stability in relationships. Men, on the other hand, are often encouraged to suppress vulnerability and outsource emotional processing. This creates a dynamic where emotional labor becomes gendered, expected from some, optional for others.
And this expectation doesn't disappear in modern or progressive environments. Even in relationships that value equality, emotional labor often falls unevenly. Who notices emotional distance first? Who initiates difficult conversations? Who apologizes to restore peace, even when they were hurt? These patterns are subtle, but they shape emotional exhaustion over time. Emotional labor, when unequal, slowly erodes intimacy rather than strengthening it.
One of the most damaging effects of emotional labor is how it becomes tied to self-worth. When someone is valued mainly for their emotional availability, they may start believing that their worth depends on how much they can give. They feel useful when they are needed, but invisible when they rest. This creates anxiety around setting limits because boundaries feel like rejection both of others and of one's own identity.
This is why emotional labor is closely connected to boundaries. Without boundaries, emotional labor becomes endless. The person continues to regulate emotions, fix conflicts, and absorb tension, even when it costs them peace. Over time, this leads to resentment, not because they care too much, but because their care is not reciprocated or respected. Understanding emotional labor helps people separate kindness from self-sacrifice.
It also gives learners permission to express themselves more honestly. When you understand emotional labor, you realize that constant politeness is not always kindness. Sometimes, clarity is the most respectful form of communication. Learning English is not only about speaking correctly, it's about speaking consciously.
As we come to the end of this episode, it's worth pausing for a moment. Emotional labor is not something most people were taught to name, but many have been practicing it for years without realizing it. Understanding this word doesn't mean blaming others or seeing every relationship as a burden. It simply gives language to experiences that were already there, waiting to be understood.
When you recognize emotional labor, you start to see your interactions more clearly. You notice where care flows naturally and where it feels forced. You begin to understand that emotional awareness is a skill, not a personality trait, and that carrying emotional weight alone is not a requirement for being kind, mature, or responsible.
Learning a word like emotional labor isn't just about vocabulary, it's about insight. It helps you describe feelings accurately, communicate boundaries more clearly, and participate in conversations, personal, academic, or professional, with more confidence and self-respect.
If this episode gave you language for something you felt but couldn't explain before, take that with you. Let the word settle. Use it carefully. And most importantly, remember that understanding does not demand exhaustion.
Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll continue exploring words that carry real meaning, depth, and relevance, words that help you understand English and yourself more clearly.
Until next time.